does the writing reflect accepted doctrine? And here we have to take a moment, we have to pause, and we have to look at the time period that we're speaking about. One of the common objections that people raise when it comes to our New Testament and what we can dub orthodoxy, and then when we look at these other texts discovered at Nag Hammadi, and they represent not orthodoxy or heresy, it's often charged that the church that became orthodox bullied those other churches out of existence. And they persecuted them until they were all gone and what became orthodoxy was the only one standing. Now that's an interesting theory, except when we talk about the time period that we're actually discussing. Here you see the Council of Jerusalem in about 50 AD. That's recorded in our book of Acts, Acts chapter 15, where the church determines that circumcision is not required to become a Christian. We have the destruction of Jerusalem in 70 AD. So actually it's between about 50 and 70 that we can actually see Christianity becoming not so much a Jewish movement, not so much a Jewish sect as we see them described in the book of Acts, and actually becoming something distinct, something that can be regarded as different, because in between those we have the Nero persecution beginning in about 64, where Nero begins to persecute the Christians but not the Jews. Then in 95 we have the Domitian persecution. You'll notice a question mark there by the Domitian persecution. History is not clear on what exactly and how intense exactly the Domitian persecution was, and I just want to acknowledge that there's lots of questions regarding the Domitian persecution. We won't get state-sponsored, as in Nero or Caesar is persecuting, again, until about 250, and then again the Diocletian persecution in 300. So here we have state persecution, and here we have state persecution. During this time period, it really depends on where you live, whether or not you'll face too much persecution. That will be much more governor persecution and much less emperor persecution. That makes sense, right? Everybody can, what I just said makes sense. You might live in a part of the Roman Empire here where the governor is not very nice to Christians and does allow people to persecute Christians. And you might live in a part of the empire where the governor doesn't care too much about this, but he doesn't want it going on. We have texts that actually talk about how to persecute Christians, when to persecute Christians, and how to test whether or not somebody is a Christian or not from the Romans' perspective during this time period. The point being, during this time period that we're talking about, Christians, depending on where they live, they may gain some local popularity. They may even, depending on their business, reach some sort of business influence. But we're not talking about a time period when the church actually has authority. We're not talking about a centralized church. We're not talking about a church that has the authority to say, let's go persecute that group. Let's break into their house and burn their scriptures and do bad things to people. And the time period that we're talking about, Christians do not have the political power to go persecute the Gnostics, to go persecute those other groups that they don't agree with. We have to keep that in mind for this question. Does the writing reflect accepted doctrine? That is, doctrine that comes from the apostles. What does Gnostic mean? Gnostic is more of a modern term that we use today to kind of describe a whole group of people that actually, even within that group, they have some differences between themselves. you know. We today have to call them something, and so as a blanket term, we kind of take everything that we might dub heresy, which is an insider term, we might dub all of them Gnostic. Gnostic generally refers to some sort of secret knowledge. Some sort of, this isn't for everybody, this information is only for the initiated. This is kind of insider information. Now, Gnosticism shows up in this time period, about 100 years before and about 100 years after Jesus. We know that they exist here. We're not really sure what they believe. That's a little bit of the nature of being an esoteric group. Esoteric meaning kind of a secretive, kind of an insiders-only group. When you have that and you don't have the internet, it was much easier to keep a secret before we invented the internet, wasn't it? Almost every group today, if you want to know what they believe, you can go online and you can find at least one source, maybe multiple sources, saying that that group over there, they believe this and that and the other. Before the invention of the internet, it was much easier to keep a secret on what it was you believed and what it was you were doing.
Were the Essenes part of that?
Yes.
Part of the Gnostic?
No. Sorry, I did not understand your question. No, the Essenes don't appear to be a Gnostic group. They appear to be a sectarian group that is in larger Second Temple Judaism, which would include Pharisees, Sadducees, peasants, and rebels. They appear in this time period. And they appear as a group that says, we're the true Judaism. And we're going to go out into the desert and we're going to practice true Judaism out here in the desert. And we're going to leave the Pharisees and the Sadducees to do their own little thing. So they are a sectarian group in that sense. They're not too much a Gnostic group in that sense. Good question. Feel free to shout out questions, by the way. During Second Temple Judaism, we have absolute monotheism in Judaism. And I can't stress enough how monotheistic Second Temple Judaism was. Second Temple Judaism was so monotheistic to say the God of Israel is the one and only God. There are no other gods. We do see the Abrahamic religion, we do see the reference to other gods. Now, do they believe that those are real gods? Do they believe that there's some kind of demon god? What exactly they believe about them? You see them mentioned in the books of Moses. That this group has their god, that group has their god, and then through the time period of the kings, we have Jews apostatizing and worshiping pagan gods and so forth. What exactly did the Jews believe regarding their God versus the existence of other gods? We're not positive. But we know that during Second Temple Judaism, there was absolute strict monotheism. The God of Israel is the only God, and there are no other gods. Gnosticism, even though it arises and there are forms of Jewish Gnosticism, Gnosticism posits that there are more than one God, and there could be even what we would call a demiurge. A demiurge would be kind of a secondary god. And the Gnostics, especially when we get into this time period, after the end of the first century, into the second century, and so forth, the Gnostics say that the God of the Old Testament is the demiurge. He's a lesser God. He's a mean God. They agree that He created the physical world, but in many forms of Gnosticism, physical, material, bad, spiritual, non-physical, good. They have to explain the existence of physical, and so they say that the God of the Jews, bad God, mean God, vicious God. Jesus comes from the supreme being, the being over the demiurge. So, you're a Christian during this time period, and you've been going to the Matthew church, where they read Matthew and maybe they read Hebrews. You're going to the west, you're up in Asia Minor, and there you have a lot of Paul's letters, and maybe you have Luke. You're down in the Egypt area, and you have a copy of Mark, maybe you have a copy of James, something like that. You move to town and you are looking for the Christians, and you find this group of Christians, and they say, come join us over here. By the way, we have a gospel written by Peter, but it's a secret gospel. Not everybody gets to know this. Everybody can read Mark, everybody can read Matthew, that's good. But we've got this gospel, and it's written by James. And before he died, Jesus had a secret conversation with James and gave him some secret information. And you are thinking, well, if there's another apostle writing, I need to hear this. I need to go to this church meeting where they're going to read this gospel. You're sitting there and they start to read the Gospel of Peter, and it starts to talk about Jesus wasn't real. He didn't have a physical body, because physical bad, spiritual good. He was a type of phantom ghost that only appeared to have a physical body. And he didn't really die on the cross. And you're sitting there going, wait a minute. In the Matthew church, he had a physical body. In the Matthew church, he died on the cross for our sins. In this Gospel of Peter church, he's not really dying, and he's not really dying to save us. He's here to teach us some secret information. You're going to realize, wait a minute, these are two completely different doctrines. And that's one of the things that we see in these texts, especially the ones discovered at Nag Hammadi, these kind of Gnostic texts. And so that's one of those things that the early church was concerned about. Does this text reflect apostolic teaching? And there we do have to make a distinction between progressive revelation and non-orthodox teaching. Progressive revelation refers to when you begin in the book of Genesis and you're reading through the books of Moses and you're reading into Joshua and stuff, you're not getting a crucified Messiah. You get to the Psalms and you don't have this clear God sending somebody to die for you. Those are New Testament concepts that are raised here. And what progressive revelation means is as the revelation continues, you get more information. You see more of God's purpose, which is different from a complete diversion from monotheism to this God the God of the Jews is a bad God and stuff like that. So we can see there's a difference between flat out heresy and progressive revelation. For example, in the Abrahamic covenant, circumcision is the very sign of the covenant. It's the entry point into the covenant for males. And yet under the new covenant, circumcision is a non-issue. Under the Mosaic system, Exodus chapter 16, the Sabbath is established. And the Sabbath is the sign of the covenant. You get into the new covenant, and seventh-day Sabbath observance is a non-issue. I want to draw your attention to the note at the bottom of your page there. Basically, the other day I'm driving along, I'm channel surfing on the radio, and I hear somebody on one of the Christian radios saying that it's in the time of Constantine that Christians start worshiping on Sunday. That person is what we politely call wrong. You can see I give you some data that within the biblical work we have indication that Sunday has become the Christian day. We have in Justin Martyr that Sunday has become the Christian day. We have very early, we have very early Sunday in the New Testament and in the Church Fathers. So this person blaming Constantine way out here in the 4th century, once again, we just politely refer to them as wrong.